My daughter made me tea every night at 9 for 8 years. For the last 2 months of it, the woman who did my ironing was pouring half of it down the bathroom sink before it ever finished steeping. 1 week after she started doing that, I could hold a hairbrush without dropping it. 3 weeks and I could stand at the counter long enough to peel an apple. I did not tell anyone in that house for another 7 weeks. If you have ever loved someone who turned out to be the reason you could not get out of a chair, stay with me on this one. Subscribe before you go any further because I tell one of these every single day and you are going to want the next one. Hit the like button while you are here. It genuinely helps this channel find the people it is meant for. And in the comments, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. Marisol Vega has done the ironing and heavy cleaning in my house since 2003. She raised 2 boys on what my family paid her, and both finished college. On a Monday in March, she was pressing a blouse in the little room off my kitchen, and she stopped with the iron in her hand and stood there a long moment. She had been in that house every week for 21 years. She said, "Miss Aliner, how long has your hand been shaking like that at night?" I said, "A long while." She said, "No, I mean at night, after the tea." I looked at her. She said, "You do not shake like that on the mornings after Diane goes to her book club." Diane did not make my tea on book club nights. On those nights I made my own, from the same tin in the same kettle, and drank it alone in the front room. And Marisol Vega had noticed that difference over some stretch of weeks without saying one word about it to anybody. I was 71 years old. I had been using a walker for 4 years. I could not open a jar. And I had not driven a car in 2 years. And there were afternoons I lost entire hours and could not tell you what filled them. I said, "Marisol," and she said, "I know." That was the whole exchange, 1 word each. It took about 6 seconds and I have thought about it every day since. Neither of us said the word poison, not that afternoon and not for 5 weeks afterward. 2 women in a sewing room in Millbrook agreed on the worst thing either had ever considered without saying it out loud, because saying it out loud would have made it something you have to act on. Neither of us was ready. My father was Ambrose Halbrook, and he started a cabinetry works in 1954 with a barn, 1 lathe, and a contract to build pew ends for 3 churches in the county. Halbrook Fine Woodworking. Kitchen cabinetry, custom staircases, and later, when the money came in, a line of dining furniture that got carried in catalogs from Hartford to Richmond. If you have ever sat at a table with a Halbrook stamp under the leaf, something from that shop is holding your family's dinners up. My father ran it for 31 years and never once let a man on that floor call him Mr. I took the company at 34 when my father's lungs finally gave out, and I ran it for 26 years before I could not. 260 employees, 1 facility, and a name on a water tower you can see from the interstate. My father is on the wall of the front office in a photograph from 1958, standing next to the first lathe with sawdust on his forearms, and beside it is one of me in 1991 signing the papers on the new building. There is a space on that wall where the third photograph should go, and I have never let anyone put one up. I married Walter Marsh in 1975. He ran the sales side for 30 years and died of a heart attack in a hotel room in Charlotte in 2004, and I have missed him every single day since in a way that does not get smaller, only quieter. We had 2 children. Whit, my son, born in 1977, and Diane, born in 1980. Whit went into forestry management and lives 4 states away and has for a decade, and that is a different story, one I will get to. Diane stayed. She went to the State University 40 minutes away, majored in business, and came home every weekend of her 4 years there, which I thought at the time was devotion, and now understand was reconnaissance. She married a man named Colton Reyes in 2006, and they had 1 daughter, Poppy, in 2009. Colton left in 2013 and never came back, not once, not for a birthday. Diane raised that girl alone 4 streets over from mine, and I helped, and I never once resented it, and I still don't, whatever else is true. Diane came to work at Halbrook in 2007, in the front office, and she was good at it. I am not going to lie about that part, because the lie would be too easy and it would not be true. She learned the machines even though she never worked one. She sat in on supplier negotiations and said almost nothing for 2 years and then started saying things, and the things were sharp and correct. The men on the floor liked her because she remembered their kids' names, which is a rarer gift in a boss's daughter than you'd think. There is a photograph in the front hall of the two of us at the opening of the second warehouse in 2011, laughing at something the foreman said. I have not taken it down. I was diagnosed 8 years ago, at 63, with a slow autoimmune condition that attacks the signals between nerve and muscle. It started as a tremor in my right hand I blamed on too much coffee, then a heaviness in my legs by evening, then a neurologist named Priya Anand who took 5 months to name it, and set an infusion schedule that, done properly, keeps most people functional for years. I did well for 2 years. I was on a maintenance protocol, a set of infusions and daily tablets that, taken as prescribed, hold the disease roughly where it is instead of letting it advance. Diane handled the logistics. That was not sinister on its face, and every family with a sick parent knows exactly how it starts. There was a stretch where my hands shook too badly to manage the pill dispenser, so Diane filled it on Sunday nights and set it by the kettle, and then my hands got a little steadier and she kept doing it anyway, because by then it was simply a thing she did. 6 years ago it began sliding backward, slowly enough that no single week explained it. Dr. Anand adjusted the infusion dose twice, then a third time. There is a word that appears in my chart 8 times over 4 years. Non-responsive. 8 times, a careful, well-regarded doctor wrote down honestly that a treatment which works for the overwhelming majority of her patients was not working for me. And she has apologized to me since, twice, and I have told her twice there was nothing there to apologize for. And I do not think she has forgiven herself regardless. I stopped driving 5 years ago. I used a cane for 7 months, then a walker, which I hated enough to skip my own great-niece's wedding rather than be photographed with it. 4 years ago, a contractor spent 3 weeks building a ramp to my porch while I sat inside listening to the saws. 3 moments from those years I go back to more than the others. Catching my shoe on a pallet edge on the shop floor and going down in front of 9 men, a foreman named Desmond Otero getting me up so fast it looked like he'd simply reached for a clipboard, and never mentioning it again. A Tuesday I stood at my bathroom mirror for 7 minutes trying to work a button and could not. And my granddaughter's confirmation, which I skipped and blamed on the drive. And through every single one of those years, my daughter was there. She drove me to every infusion appointment. She sat in the waiting room at the clinic in Hartford reading a paperback for 2 hours at a stretch. She learned how to help me from the chair to the bed, which is a genuine skill and not an easy one, and she did it several times a day for years, and she strained something in her lower back doing it and never complained about it where I could hear her. She was kind to me constantly. That is the thing that people who hear this story afterward cannot make fit together in their heads, and I have stopped trying to make it fit in mine either. She was kind, and she made my tea every night at 9:00, and she was doing what she was doing the entire time. 3 years ago, I signed a durable power of attorney. It was the sensible thing to do. Diane became my attorney in fact, could vote my shares, sign for me, do nearly anything I could do. And by then, she was effectively running Halbrook anyway, 4 days a week at the head of the conference table, and the leadership team went along with it because the alternative was a sick woman on a speakerphone who kept losing her place. Whit started coming around less around that same time, though he'd tell you now it was never a decision. He had a job 4 states away and a family of his own, and there were weekends he meant to make the drive and didn't. There was also a stretch where he called the house and got Diane, and was told I was having a rough patch. Then several rough patches. Then, honestly, Whit, too many people overwhelm her, and it takes days to settle after. Diane started calling him instead, warm and full of updates, and Whit, with no wish to be a burden on a household under strain, stopped calling the house and simply waited for the update. 2 years ago, he drove 4 hours to drop off a birthday gift on a day he knew I'd be at the plant. His badge, which had opened that door since he was 17, did not work. The man at the front desk had known him since he was in diapers, looked at the screen, and said he was sorry there was a list he couldn't show it to him. Whit was told, gently, that families get strange when somebody's dying and that he should let it be. Everyone let it be. Everyone had a reasonable explanation. That is how you take a woman apart. Not with anything dramatic. With a dozen reasonable explanations handed to a dozen people who never once compare notes. Poppy was 14 then. She was in and out of my house constantly. She had a key to the cabinet where the pill dispenser lived. She was the one, most Sundays, who refilled it while her mother was at the store. I am going to come back to that. Let me stop here for one moment, because we're coming up on the part of this I have never said out loud in one sitting, not even to my own son. If you're still with me, do me one favor. Subscribe. Not later now, while you're thinking of it. I post a new one of these every single day, true stories about what people will do to somebody who can no longer get up out of a chair on her own. Hit the like button on your way past. And down in the comments, tell me this. She drove her mother to appointments for years. She hurt her own back lifting me out of that chair. She sat in a hospital parking lot reading a paperback for 2 hours at a stretch, over and over, for years. Do you believe a person can do all of that and be doing the other thing at the same time? Because I lived inside it, and I still cannot make those two women into the same woman. Tell me what you think. I read every one of them. After Marisol said what she said, I did nothing for 3 days. That was not courage, and I am not going to dress it up as strategy. I was 71 years old. I could not open a jam jar or dial a phone without help, and a woman I had trusted for 2 decades had just suggested something that, if true, meant my own daughter was poisoning me, and if false, meant I was a frightened old woman turning on the child who lifted me in and out of bed. What I did over those 3 days was test her, and not cleverly. On the second evening, I asked Diane, apropos of nothing, whether Dr. Anand had mentioned trying a different infusion protocol at the last visit. She said she had, and that they'd discussed it, and that Dr. Anand didn't think a change was worth the risk given how poorly I'd tolerated the last adjustment. She said all of it while folding laundry, entirely relaxed, and there was nothing in her face at all. And that, oddly, is what decided me. Because a woman with nothing to hide, and a woman who has been hiding something for 6 years look exactly the same by year 6. On the third day I said, do it. She said, do what? I said, whatever it is you've already decided to do. She said, all right. The next evening she pressed the tea before Diane got to the kettle. That was it. That was the entire operation, and it never once got more sophisticated than a woman standing in a kitchen at 10 to 9. The first thing that came back was not strength. It was the evenings. For 6 years, I had lost the hours between 9 and midnight to a gray fog 4 doctors couldn't explain, and eventually I'd stopped mentioning it. Within days, I was staying lucid through an entire hour of the news I used to lose halfway through. One weekend, I held a hairbrush without dropping it. I was alone in my bedroom, and I set it down and stood there a long while, because if this was working, it was true, and you do not want it to be true. Everyone who hears a story like this assumes relief. I was not relieved. I sat on the edge of that bed and understood I was going to have to go back through 6 years and reread every single one of them. 3 weeks in, I stood at the kitchen counter long enough to peel an apple, both hands steady enough to hold the peeler without shaking it onto the floor. Marisol stood close enough to catch me the whole time and didn't say a word until I set the peel down in one long curl on the cutting board. Then she said, there it is. 5 weeks in, I stood without the walker for the first time. Not well, 3 feet holding the dresser before my legs gave and Marisol caught my elbow. She was crying. I was not, and I've thought about that since. She sat on the floor with her back against the dresser and said something in Spanish I didn't ask her to translate, and we stayed there 10 minutes without saying anything else in either language. Then I worked out that I had 2 problems. The first was that if I told anyone now, a doctor, a lawyer, my son, Diane would know within a day. She had the power of attorney. She spoke directly to Dr. Anand's office. She had the mail and the phone and the money and the calendar. What would I have against that? A housekeeper's suspicion and an old woman who felt a bit steadier. The second problem was that I was getting stronger, and getting stronger would eventually be visible. So I decided to stay sick for another 4 weeks. The easy part was that I already knew exactly how to be that woman, because I'd been her for 6 years. I knew where I let my hands rest. I knew what my voice did when it wanted to sound tired. The hard part was the physical work. You cannot rebuild a body from a walker without moving, and I could not move where anyone could see me doing it. So it happened between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, 4 days a week, in the small guest room upstairs, on the days Diane was at the plant. Marisol stood in the doorway where she could watch the driveway. I walked from the bed to the window and back 9 feet. The first days I managed it twice and had to lie down after. Marisol counted out loud, not for encouragement, but because in those early days I lost track of numbers past 3 or 4 and would simply stop. By the second month I was doing 30 minutes and going up and down the back stairs holding both rails. The rail took skin off both palms in the first 2 weeks, so I wore gardening gloves and told Deanne my circulation had gotten worse. She bought me a second pair, cashmere-lined, with a note that said, "For the cold hands." And every evening my daughter came home from the plant and asked how my day had been, and I told her it had been a quiet one. There were nights I nearly told her, not from weakness, but from the sheer impossibility of the arrangement. She'd come in at 6, kiss the top of my head, ask about physical therapy, and she was, I have no other word for it, lovely. And I'd think, this cannot be what I think it is. Then in the morning, she'd set the tea at my right hand where it had gone every night for 8 years, and Marisol would empty half of it down the sink an hour later. I found a man named Warren Cassidy through a note. 22 years with the state police, financial crimes mostly, running his own practice out of a strip mall office 2 towns over. It took 4 days to produce 11 words in a notebook Marisol carried and mailed from a post office in the next county. I won't tell you all 11. 6 were, "I think my daughter is poisoning me." The rest was the name of an attorney my late husband had once used, that I remembered lying awake at 2 in the morning. Cassidy called 9 days later. He told me he gets 4 or 5 notes like that a year, most from people who are unwell, and that what made him call on this one was the handwriting, slow, careful, steady, because a genuinely confused person writes fast and sloppy. He said, "Mrs. Marsh, I'm going to ask you to do the hardest thing I've ever asked anyone, change absolutely nothing for a while." I told him I'd already worked that out. Here is what Cassidy built over the following 6 weeks, almost none of it from inside my house. He started with the pharmacy, dispense date, day supply, gap between refills, 6 years' worth, which I was entitled to see. The pattern was the entire case. For 2 years, my medication refilled on a rhythm consistent with someone taking it as directed. 6 years ago, the gaps began opening, refills stretching to 50 and 60 days on a 30-day supply. The insurance claims matched. Dr. Anand had been treating me for 6 years for a disease that was not responding to a treatment I was not actually taking. Then Cassidy did the thing that turned negligence into a crime. He arranged for me to be tested, not through Dr. Anand's office, since Diane had access to all of it. On a Wednesday when Diane was at a supplier conference overnight, Marisol and Cassidy drove me to a private lab across the state line, where a physician drew blood under a proper chain of custody form. Getting me into that car took 19 minutes. A neighbor walking her dog waved. I waved back. I have never been as frightened as I was standing in that parking lot in daylight. The results came back 12 days later. The medication showed up at a trace, consistent with someone taking a fraction of the prescribed dose. And there was a second finding, a sedating compound at a level with no medical explanation that a forensic toxicologist would later call inconsistent with any accidental exposure. That's the whole of what I'll say about what was in it. What it did was make a woman who was already weak look, to every doctor who examined her, like a woman in natural decline. Then Cassidy found the money. Over 3.5 years as my attorney, in fact, Diane had moved just under $1.4 million into an entity called Millbrook Heritage Holdings, formed 14 months after I signed the power of attorney, of which she was the sole member. She'd put Poppy, then 20, on the Halbrook payroll at $58,000 a year with no work product on file. She'd taken a distribution in a year the company hadn't declared one. She'd changed the beneficiary on a life insurance policy, not to herself, but to a trust naming Poppy. And 4 months before Marisol ever said a word to me, she'd retained a firm out of Boston to explore a sale. That last piece is what turned it from theft into a clock. Halbrook was held inside a family trust my father had set up before he died, structured the way those things get structured. As long as it stayed a company, it was principal, and principal did not touch Diane's hands. Sell it for cash, and the trust would be holding a pile of money that gets managed and moved by whoever's directing the trustee, and by then that was Diane. She had understood since she'd first read that trust document years earlier that she was never going to inherit Halbrook itself. She was going to liquidate it while I was still alive and still hers to direct. Cassidy put it in one line near the end of his report, and I keep that page in a drawer. Subject's interest is in the continued incapacity of the principal, not her death. That's the answer to the question everyone asks me, which is why 8 years, why not simply get it over with? Because dying, I was worth a modest trust distribution to her. Alive and in that chair, I was worth all of it. The board meeting was set for a Thursday morning at the plant, second-floor conference room with the windows over the loading yard. Purpose: approval of an asset purchase agreement with a private firm out of Boston called Ridgeline Capital Partners. $94 million for the operating assets, 260 employees, and a phrase in the deck about consolidation of production that meant the Millbrook plant would close within 18 months. Cassidy and I had the full file by then. Pharmacy records, the toxicology, the chain of custody, the money, 6 years of medical charts documenting a decline nobody had ever thought to look for a cause behind. The county prosecutor's office took 2 weeks with it, which Cassidy told me was fast. The warrant was signed on a Monday. They planned to arrest Diane at the house Tuesday morning. I asked them to wait until Thursday. Cassidy told me it was a bad idea, that the worst possible outcome in a case like this is a defendant with 3 extra days and a bad feeling, and that people do worse things than run. I told him she wasn't going to run because she had never once in 6 years done anything that looked like panic. He said that's not a reason, that's a bet. He was right. I made it anyway, for one reason. 260 people worked in that building, and I wasn't going to let that vote happen and try to unwind it afterward. Wednesday night, Diane made dinner and told me about the deck, and about a director she was worried about. She cut my meat for me, because my hands still weren't steady enough in front of her, and I let her. There was a warrant with her name on it in a courthouse 9 miles from where we sat, and she'd handed me a cup of tea that evening the same as every other evening. She said, "You're quiet." I said I was tired. Later, she put her hand on mine on the table, the way she had 10,000 times before, and said, "We're nearly through the worst of this, Mama." I said, "I thought so too." Thursday morning, Marisol dressed me in a suit I hadn't worn in 3 years. It hung on me. There's a thing I've never told anyone about that morning. I sat on the edge of the bed while she did the buttons and could not get my breath for a full 3 minutes, hands flat on my knees like a runner at the end of a race. She didn't tell me it would be fine. She said, "Miss Aliner, we're going to be late." Whit drove. I'd called him Tuesday from Cassidy's office, the first time in 2 years he'd heard my voice without his sister in the room, and told him almost nothing except an address, a time, and that he shouldn't come to the house first. He asked one question. "Are you all right?" I said, "I'm going to be." He was outside that plant at 8:40 that morning with both hands on the wheel, and when I got out of the passenger seat under my own power, he made a sound I'm not going to try to describe. The meeting started at 9. I know how the first several minutes went because 7 people have told me since. Diane opened. The Ridgeline people presented for 20 minutes. A longtime director named Yolanda Ash asked 3 sharp questions about the consolidation language and didn't like the answers. At 9:38 they moved to the vote. Whit walked me to the conference room door and stopped. I said, "Wait here." He said, "No." I said, "Whit, wait here." He said, "I've waited 2 years," and opened the door for me. I walked the length of that table, which I've since measured at 26 feet. Nobody said a word. That's the part people never believe. No gasp, nobody standing up. 9 people at a table watched a woman they'd all been told for years could not walk unassisted cross a room, and the room made no sound at all. I looked at my daughter. She had one hand flat on the deck in front of her and did not move it. Her face did something I've never seen on another human being, before or since, and I don't have the words for it. It wasn't fear. It was arithmetic. I watched my own daughter try to work out, in about 3 seconds, what she could still salvage. I handed the corporate secretary a notarized revocation of the power of attorney, executed 6 days earlier, and said that as of that document my daughter had no authority to vote my shares or act on my behalf in any capacity, that I was voting against the transaction, and that the board could proceed however the chair saw fit. Yolanda Ash stood up out of her chair like she'd been waiting 2 years to do exactly that, and said, "The transaction fails." 2 detectives came through the same door I'd come through, and one of them said my daughter's name as a question, and she said, "Yes." They arrested her at that table, in front of the board, in front of the Ridgeline team, in front of 260 people working downstairs who wouldn't learn anything had happened until the second shift came in. She put her hands behind her back before either detective asked her to. She looked at me the whole time. She said one thing on the way out. She said, "Mama, how long?" I said, 8 years. I've been asked why I gave her that. Because it was the first straight question either of us had asked the other in 6 years, and I wasn't going to be the one who lied. The trial was 9 days. First-degree assault, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, theft over $100,000. They considered attempted murder and didn't bring it. That would require proving she wanted me dead, and every piece of evidence proved the opposite. The defense argued I'd been non-compliant out of stubborn pride, and that a confused old woman had been turned against her devoted daughter by a resentful housekeeper and a paid investigator. The first argument nearly landed. What killed it was the second toxicology finding, the one with no innocent explanation. Marisol was on the stand for 2 hours and 10 minutes. Defense counsel asked whether she'd ever been disciplined in that house. No. Whether she'd requested a raise and been refused. Yes, in 2020, whether she'd resented it. She'd thought it was unfair and kept working there anyway. Then why she'd never gone to the police herself. She said, because they would have believed her and not me. He asked what she meant. She said, "Sir, I clean houses." He moved on. There was nowhere else to go with it, and everyone in that room, including the jury, understood why. The jury was out 3 hours and 40 minutes. Guilty on every count. At sentencing, the judge said something I've read the transcript of more times than I'll admit. She said that in 20 years on that bench she'd seen a great deal of violence, and that most of it took a few seconds, and that this had taken 8 years and required the defendant to wake up every single morning and choose it again. 22 years. Diane will be in her early 60s when she's released. They charged Poppy too. I asked them not to. The prosecutor turned out to be right and I turned out to be wrong. She took a plea, 18 months suspended, probation and restitution she'll still be paying off in her 40s. She was 20 when it started. There's a photograph of her at 9 on that farmhouse porch, wearing my father's old cap, laughing at whoever's holding the camera, which was me. I have not spoken to her since and don't expect I will again. I went to see Diane once, after sentencing, at the women's facility upstate. 40 minutes on the highway, which I mention because 18 months earlier I couldn't have made it to the mailbox. She'd lost weight. She looked at my hands first, then my face, and asked how I was. I told her I was walking almost 3 miles a day. She said good and meant it, and that's the thing about her that has never once resolved for me. She asked about Poppy before anything else, the only question that whole visit that wasn't about herself. I told her about the will amended years ago to divide what I own outside the trust between her, Whit, and Poppy in equal thirds, never announced. She didn't react to the number, a sum that size stops being money and starts being weather. I told her I knew she'd read the trust years before any of this began and never once asked me a single question, and that if she had, I'd have told her everything that day. She looked at the table a long while. Then she said, "Mama, that's all." My name and nothing behind it. I stood up, put my chair back under the table, and left. Whit lives 11 minutes from me now. He and his family moved back the year after the trial, and Sunday mornings he comes by and we don't do anything in particular. He was angry for a long while, not at me, at himself, for 3 years of accepting that today was a bad day. I told him he'd been lied to by an expert. If a board-certified neurologist couldn't see it, a busy man 4 states away was never going to. Marisol doesn't clean my house anymore. It took 5 months to talk her into stopping. I bought the house she'd rented on Kestrel Lane for 18 years and put it in her name outright, no mortgage, no strings, plus a fund paying her what she was making, backdated raise included, for life. She fought me on it, told me she hadn't done any of it for that. I said I knew. She said, "Then why?" I said, "Because I can." She said, "That's not a reason." She took it in the end because her son told her to. I still have the disease, and it's not going anywhere, but treated properly, it does exactly what the doctors always said it would. I walk close to 3 miles most days now. I'm back at the head of that conference table twice a week. Yolanda Ash chairs it the rest of the time. The plant is still open, with 271 people working there now. Here's what I've come to after 2 years of turning this over. My mother used to say that some people mistake being needed for being loved. I said that to Diane once, offhand, at a kitchen table, Years before any of this, about someone else entirely, a warning meant for nobody, and my daughter kept it. The way people keep the smallest things you hand them without noticing. I don't know what she did with it in her own head over the years, and I'm not going to pretend I do. None of that makes what she did anything other than exactly what she did. She had 100 ways out. She could have asked me about the trust the day she read it, and I'd have told her everything inside a minute. She could have simply asked for more, and I'd have given it. She chose the version where she got everything and kept me too. There's one more thing I don't have peace with. For 6 years, 260 people worked in a building my father built with his own hands, and their jobs were being quietly steered toward a sale, and not one of them ever picked up a phone and called the woman whose name was on the water tower. Yolanda fought Diane at that table for 2 years and never once drove out to the farmhouse. I asked her gently because I love that woman. She said, "Eleanor, we were told you couldn't follow a conversation anymore, told by your daughter, who was right there every day, and we had no reason to doubt her, and every one of us felt terrible and sent flowers. That's how it works. Nobody has to be corrupt. Somebody just has to be the only source of information, and everyone around them being decent looks exactly like doing nothing at all." If you got something out of this one, subscribe before you go. That's the one that actually matters. I put a new story up every single day, and the next one is already written. Hit like on your way out. It genuinely helps this reach the people it's for. And down in the comments, tell me the honest thing. She hurt her own back lifting me for years and never complained where I could hear it. Do you believe a person can turn, or do you believe she was always going to, and the good years were just the wait? I read every single one of them. I'll see you in the next one.